Well, we are in the book of Judges, chapter 8, looking at the end of Gideon's life. And really, I was intending at first to go all the way to the end of the chapter, verse 35, but just a little bit for sake of time, because we had a long day today. But also because actually verses 29 through 35 really are a transition and move you into the book or the chapter right after chapter 9. So it's a little bit of a transition. I thought it might serve better as a setup to what happens next than a conclusion. So hopefully it'll make sense as we go through it. But again, we come to the end of Gideon's life, and it ends almost as it started, with a series of tests. If you remember, Gideon's life has been full of these moments where God is telling him to do something and he wavers. He can't believe it. He's unsure of himself. He's reluctant. And here at the end, it's almost like last week where you're not quite exactly sure. What is Gideon's motivation? Why is he doing the things that he's doing? Is it noble or is it not? We come a little bit to that question here as well, but what we can perhaps say, as we say with all the Old Testament scriptures, whatever it is speaking to Gideon specifically, it is also speaking to us that it's not Gideon who's being tested anymore. His time is past, but it is us in our hearts that are being tested. So we come to the end of Gideon's life, and there are two tests here. Call them the test of royalty and the test of loyalty. First, we come to the test of royalty. So after this great victory, which we talked about, how Gideon had finally defeated the Midianites, in particular in the form of overcoming and capturing these two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and then upon executing them, bringing peace to the land. We come to verse 22. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian." Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. Yahweh will rule over you." There's a test of royalty that comes upon Gideon, that they are offering their subjugation to him as a gift. We are willing to submit to your authority and your dominion. In fact, we are not only going to be committed to you, but to your son and your grandson also. In other words, they want to establish a monarchy through the line of Gideon. They see his conquest of Midian as the appropriate credentials for a king. And back then, certainly you could make the case that most often might makes right. And so the biggest, baddest guy in the yard would be the one who could wear the crown and tell everyone else what to do. It's a little bit simpler back then, I suppose. Now, it is true that the one who conquered Midian is certainly the one who should be king. But what's wrong in their analysis? Who was it that conquered the Midianites? Was it Gideon? No. We know too much of the story to think that Gideon is the hero here. You know, and I know, and Gideon knows that it is Yahweh who is deserving of that title and that crown. I think it's a little bit ironic, this answer. Because let's be very fair to Gideon. He nails the answer. Right? This is 100% A+ on your theology test to deny the crown and to say it's Yahweh who will rule over you. This is not a monarchy. This is a theocracy. God is the ruler, the theos, which is the Greek word for God. Now, I wonder if Gideon, a lot of thought goes into, and a lot of ink is spilled on, what was Gideon's motivation for saying this? If you remember, I quoted a commentator, Block, who was very critical of Gideon and his motivations, and essentially saw, even in the passage before in chapter 8, that a lot of what he did was selfishly motivated, or it was not the deeds and acts of a noble person. And he thinks here that Gideon's sincerity is in question for a number of reasons. But one actually I didn't see, it didn't occur to me until just now actually reading it, is there's at least one reason that's just very pragmatic why Gideon would say, I don't want to be your king. Because he knows just how faithful the Israelites would be to a king. After all, not only had he just confronted Sukkot and Penuel, who had so easily and quickly sided with Midian, and even when Gideon confronted them about it, still rejected the judge of Israel as being the one who had authority over them. But what does Gideon also know? This faithless people, as soon as a judge leaves, they go whoring after other gods. And that's exactly what's gonna happen here. But Gideon, on a pragmatic level, might have said, you guys are a bunch of turncoats. Why would I be your king when you're just going to backstab me in the next second? So yeah, I'm not going to be your king. You won't even have me. You'll let me be king for a day, and then you'll be looking for a new guy. So there may be a pragmatic reason there. That's a little bit cynical to think that way. But let's take the focus off of Gideon just for just a moment and consider that the heart of the people to even ask this to begin with. Because when the people were asking Gideon to be king, they were actually saying something about God, weren't they? Or maybe to put it better, they were saying something about who they thought God was not, which is their king. They did not conceive that Yahweh is the one that's in charge here, that Gideon is just an instrument of his hand. They didn't think of God being the ruler on the throne over the Israelite people and their nation. And so to give Gideon the credit and not Yahweh, it's saying something really more about their own hearts and their thoughts about God than about Gideon per se. After all, they had been warned many, many times. This is the problem that we see over and over again. They know that they cannot put a person in charge. They know that at best, a judge is in charge, and as soon as they die, they go wayward. But not only that, they have seen in their entire experience of the conquest and their wanderings in the Exodus and the memory of their parents and the stories they told of how they were in Egypt and all these things, they should have known that if they try to do things outside of God's plan and purpose, disaster is all that awaits them. And then, of course, there are simply just the commands and words of God in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy that tell them that Yahweh is their king. It says something about them, that they would not acknowledge that Gideon didn't have a right to be their king. Should not have even been asked. The thought should not have even entered their hearts. And isn't it interesting that they say that they're willing to subject themselves to a king. But what does it really mean that they were willing to subject themselves to a king? Was it really this selfless act where they are committing, they're bending the knee in fealty to Gideon? Or is it that they thought, I will get good things. This is about what I'm getting out of this deal. And if the Midianites are not in charge, that's great. If our king is some heroic figure and can defeat all our enemies, that's great. If they're thinking just of what they get out of submitting to Gideon, is it really true? The true words of a subject, of a king. And it's interesting that this issue is going to come up again, because the last judge, Samuel, of whom the books 1 and 2 Samuel are named after, the last judge, Samuel, will be the last judge precisely because of this issue, the Israelites are going to clamor for a king, and this time, Yahweh is going to concede to it. If you look at 1 Samuel, you don't have to turn there, but if you wanted to take a look at the passage, it's a couple books over. 1 Samuel chapter 8, notice this. We'll start in verse 4. And then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to Yahweh. And Yahweh said to Samuel, "Obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." It's fascinating that here, this time, Samuel, of course, being almost furious that they would even ask for a king, sort of sounds like Gideon, and yet Yahweh says here exactly what we're saying, that the people were rejecting God by making this request that Gideon be their king, but Yahweh concedes to it. Why? Because he's going to do this wonderful thing that God does, is give you the thing you think you want, let it be miserable, and then give you the thing you really need. So he's going to give them kings. And they're going to be a very mixed bag. For the most part, it's going to end very poorly with the line of kings. And that's why you have this whole string of narratives from 2 Samuel to 1 Kings and 2 Kings and 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. And all that details, those very long narrative sections of the Bible, is the folly of the people to ask for a king other than Yahweh. But then God does this amazing thing, of course, is in the midst of that, he's going to use their sinful desire and produce something good. That is, he is going to bring about a king from the line of David the king, who will be a perfect king, king forever, King Messiah Jesus. And you know what's very interesting about Jesus in his earthly ministry? He is actually the King of Kings. But you know, he rejects kingship on a number of occasions in the Gospels. Maybe you don't think of it this way, but when Satan in Matthew chapter 4 tempts Jesus in the wilderness before he begins his 3-year mission, in Matthew chapter 4, Satan tempts him with the rule and the reign over the world, if only he would bow down and worship Satan. But he kind of makes an offer of kingship, and Jesus says no. And then, at the height, you could argue, of Jesus' popularity, in John chapter 6, he also has an opportunity to be the king. And what does he do? John chapter 6, maybe you're familiar with it, but John chapter 6 is the feeding of the 5,000. It's the only miracle besides the resurrection that's recounted in all 4 of the Gospels, and you could call it a highlight. You could call it one of the greatest ministry successes of Jesus' life, because he has gathered tens of thousands who are clamoring for him, and in John 6:15, they try to make him king. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. He rejected the kingship. He rejected the royalty test. In fact, what he does is, after they chase him down, because they're very earnest about making him king, why? Why did they want to willingly subject themselves to him? Jesus exposes their hearts. He says, "You are not seeking me because of who I am, but because your bellies were filled." He calls them out that they really don't want him, they want what he can do. Just like Gideon. We want what you can do. And then Jesus offends them greatly by offering to them, well, okay, you want something to eat? Eat my flesh, drink my blood. How's that? Of course, they're grossed out. They think this is horrific. And then they start grumbling. And John 6:66, I think that's very appropriate. And John 6:66 says, after this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. I always remember that verse because it's John 6:66. And Jesus said to the 12, do you want to go away as well? Simon Peter, in one of those rare moments where he just gets it right, he says, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. The point being that Jesus he rejects the royalty and the kingship, even though he is actually the King of Kings. Why does he do that? Because he wants to communicate something about kingship and authority that is upside down. And this is why sometimes they call the kingdom of God the upside down kingdom, because he says this. We read this morning, and I know you guys memorize everything, that's said on a Sunday morning. But in Mark chapter 10, James and John, they come to Jesus asking to sit at his right and left hand. And we also know that the disciples frequently argued amongst themselves about who was the greatest. But what does Jesus say about the kingdom? Verse 42 of Mark 10. You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It's talking about kings, right? The pagan and secular kings. But Jesus, but it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. I mean, this is such a tremendous statement that the royalty test, if Gideon is responding to this test, the royalty test, as a man of character, he would be affirming it in the same way that Jesus is affirming the character and nature of true greatness. That it is the one who serves who is truly great, the one who sacrifices who is truly something in the kingdom of heaven. How are you doing with the royalty test? Now, you're probably saying, no one's ever offered me a throne before. No one's ever offered me, to be royal. I've never had the opportunity to marry into a royal family. So what are you talking about? I guess in a way I'm saying no to royalty every day because no one's ever offering or asking it of me. Well, you and I know that there's many ways that we are offered this kind of promise. That just in exchange for celebrity and fame and fortune, just give up who you are. Just deny the Lord. How are you doing with the royalty test if it means that Jesus, the King of Kings, says, the greatest among you will be the least of all, and the servant of all? That's how you know you're passing the royalty test and saying no to that offer to be king, where Jesus alone should be king, is if you have a servant's heart. I found this statistic staggering. In the US and UK, a survey that was done on behalf of Lego, the survey asked 3,000 kids in the US and UK and China what they wanted to be when they grew up, and they gave them 5 options. A YouTuber, a teacher, an athlete, professional athlete, a musician, and an astronaut. Just kind of those main sort of categories, right? In both the US and UK, vlogger/YouTuber was the most popular choice by about 30%. 30% of kids want to be famous and popular and have influence over others. I mean, that's kingship, but not, in that words of royalty. Our kids are choosing that, but we know it's at the sacrifice of their soul. It's a sacrifice of their commitment and their submission to the Lord. Astronaut was the least popular, 11%. In China, the trend was opposite, actually, where half of the respondents wanted to be astronauts. And then they point out that in China, they block TikTok and a lot of the social media stuff. So, they say, we're not exactly sure of the connection, but it might be the case that since we don't expose the Chinese, and, they do a lot of bad stuff. They censor a lot of stuff, of course. But one of the things they censor is all the stupid stuff on TikTok and YouTube. And so, possibly there's a correlation that they don't expose their children to that stuff. How are you doing with the royalty test? Do you want to be king? Or are you showing actually that Jesus is the king in your life? Second test is the loyalty test. Verse 24, and Gideon said to them, let me make a request of you. You made me an offer, let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil. For they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, we will willingly give them. And they spread a cloak, and every man threw in it the earrings of his spoil. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold. Besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, and besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels, which we talked about last time. And Gideon made an ephod of it, and put it in his city, in Ophrah. And all Israel whored after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. So Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more, and the land had rest 40 years in the days of Gideon. We mentioned this last week, talking about the jewelry off the camels of the two Midianite kings, where they had these crescents that were around their necks. And the idea here is that the Israelites had gathered, and Ishmaelite there is just a reference to any nomadic people. I mean, Ishmael specifically would have been that tribe from the children of Hagar and Abraham, who were, not of the covenant, but Ishmael and his sons would have been technically the tribe of Ishmael. But this is just a reference to any kind of nomadic people, like the Midianites. So the Midianites had been defeated. 135,000 of them were routed, and all of their stuff was spoil for those Israelites who had participated in the campaign. So they'd gathered all these things, and Gideon, while rejecting their request to make him king, he requested that he use the spoils to create an ephod. Now, these pieces of jewelry weren't just adornments or ornamental, but they were likely associated with idol worship. The crescent moon on the camel's neck, again, for example, would have been associated with the moon goddess Astarte and moon worship. And similarly, they had earrings and nose rings and necklaces and all those things, and that would have all been a reference to, or some part of, just like people now wear crosses and things, it would have been something that they had that would have had something to do with their pagan religion. Now, the amount of gold here, 1,700 shekels, could have been, let's say, anywhere between, they say, 40 to 75 pounds of gold. It's a conservative estimate, let's say 40 to 45 pounds. That would be worth almost, we could probably round it to $1 million worth of gold that he gathered there. What is an ephod? An ephod is like a special breastplate. And it is really only mentioned, at least as far as Israel's history that we've kind of read through so far, so Genesis through Deuteronomy, is that special priestly ephod described in Exodus 28:15 through 30, which was a part of the holy attire of the high priest. And so that was a special breastplate that only the high priest wore, and had a very specific detailing of what it looked like. But the idea of a special breastplate, I mean, a lot of different cultures had that. But in the Bible, biblically, there's only one that's ever described or mentioned or prescribed to have any impact on Israelite nation. So it's not likely that Gideon was trying to create like a priestly ephod or a religious one. Now, here's the thing. You can take this as Gideon being very pure-hearted and trying to set up a symbol of God's rule and his reign. I mean, he said no to being a king, and he accomplished all of these great things, and so why take the negative view that he intended this to be some sore spot? We could take the view that he was just trying to set up in his hometown a symbol of God's victory over the Midianites, nothing to do with Gideon. And MacArthur kind of leans that way, John MacArthur. But I don't know. I mean, like last week, I don't necessarily see that all that Gideon did was so pure-hearted and that everything he did was so noble. And you can reference that sermon if you missed it. Because, I mean, he said no to the responsibilities of being king, but he certainly didn't mind the gold and the purple robes and the crescent ornaments and the fancy ephod. And then to put it up in your home city, which doesn't necessarily have any significance for the people of Israel. We don't even know, even now, where Ophrah exactly is. So it seems a little suspicious to just put it in your hometown, in your city, and say this is to declare, God's goodness and his glory. In any case, I mean, we don't necessarily know. We know what happened, but we don't necessarily that Gideon wanted that to happen. It could have been well-intentioned, and that's sort of the definition of what a snare is. We'll talk about that in a second. But there's going to be an irony. Either way, we don't know necessarily Gideon's heart behind it, but there's an irony because the story started when God told him in his hometown to tear down the idols to Baal and to Asherah that his father had erected in the town, right? That's where the story started, how Gideon got that name Jerubbaal. It means the one who wrestles or contends with Baal because he tore down these altars. And now here he is at the end of his life, and what does he set up? Whether wittingly or unwittingly, an ephod that became an idol and a test that Gideon and his family would fail. He left a test that would eventually bring ruin to his family. And you'll see that in Gideon 9. The text here says that all Israel whored after it there. They whored after this symbol of the conquest, the seeming symbol of man's achievement and not God's. They whored after what God could do, not God himself. That's what this ephod seemed to symbolize. We talked before about that word all, that all Israel was sinning, or all Israel. It's come up before in Judges, and I think we mentioned, like, well, what does that mean? Like this, what percentage of Israel could be going after other gods before you would say all Israel? I mean, there's times where you might say, well, if 80% of people are doing something at this church, wouldn't you say everybody at this church is doing that? Well, I'm inclined to think all Israel, if it's not every single man, woman, and child, it's certainly saying that this, like a precise number, it's enough to say it was the spirit of the age, that even if not every Israelite came and worshipped, let's say, this ephod, everyone was okay with it. Everyone signed off on it. So even if I don't even want to even think of naming a practice that say, 80% of this church was engaged in, but if the other 20% are like okay with it, that's all. Does that make sense? Like if we're all, I'm not doing it, but I'm going to let it happen, that's all. And the idea is that maybe not every single Israelite had gone to this ephod and lusted after it or worshipped or whatever. Everyone thought it was okay. All Israel whored after this thing. And unfortunately, the word whore, or playing the harlot, often applied to Israel's relationship to her God, because it's often described as a marriage. And it calls to mind an unfaithful wife or a faithless harlot or prostitute. It is to choose someone else over the husband or wife you've covenanted yourself to. And it represents betrayal of a trusted person and a selfish pursuit of one's own desires over and against the good and well-being of your marriage partner. It is despicable and vile for a person to do this to another person that they've committed themselves to. And so how much worse is it for a person to go after another god or another thing besides the one who made you, the one who loved you? Israel, as we know, could not be faithful to our God. That's the story of their life. They would not be faithful to a judge or a king, or even to themselves and each other. Remember what happened again at Penuel and Sukkot. They couldn't even be loyal to each other. There's an absolute failure in this test of loyalty. Perhaps arguably, Gideon passed the loyalty test, and yet he, if not him, his family and all Israel failed the loyalty test. And whether he intentionally did that, we'll just talk about that in a second, or not, it's hard to say. But the result of it was clearly that the whole nation itself was stumbled by what he did. A snare, a trap, a temptation that we lay for ourselves is almost the worst kind of sin. It's when you set yourself up for failure. Now, maybe it was well-intentioned but foolish for Gideon to make this ephod. Maybe it was the subtle indulgence of some tiny little corner of his heart that said, well, maybe I would like some acknowledgement and praise. And he let that little tiny corner of his heart, he indulged it and let it seep out in this request. Or maybe it was really just a very intentional but sneaky way to get praise for his accomplishments and his achievements. But a snare it was, and it reminds us that there's always room for wisdom in our lives. There's always room for questioning our motives. There's always room to call out whether our pride is in something that we're thinking or we're doing. Spurgeon, I think I like Spurgeon's take on this passage best. He says, he did not set up an idol, but he made an ephod, an imitation of that wonderful vestment worn by the high priest. Perhaps he made it of solid gold, not to be worn, but to be looked at, simply to remind the people of the worship of God and not to be itself worshipped. But dear friends, you see here that if we go half an inch beyond what God's word warrants, we always get into mischief. You hear people say, we have such and such symbols, not to worship, but to help us in worship. Yes, but the tendency of the symbol is to act as a dam to the stream of devotion and to make it end there. God forbid that we should ever violate the rules that Christ has laid down for us. The slightest deviation from the simplicity of the gospel may lead us away into sheer apostasy. Whence have come all the errors of Rome, but from little accretions and alterations, a little ornament here, a little symbol there, and a little variation of truth yonder, and the gigantic system of Romanism has thus been created. Gideon probably meant well. And we may do wrong even though we mean well. May the Lord preserve us from the smallest departure from the way that he has marked out for us in his holy word. Amen. John Owen, I think, puts it very simply. Be killing sin, or sin will be killing you. We are being called here to be vigilant, to not let anything become a stumbling block for ourselves or for others. But it is, of course, exhausting and tiring work to question yourself, which is why I think it is important, and we've been talking about this or started talking about this in the Sunday morning services. That's why we need other people. That's why we need other people who have gifts different than ours. That's why we need a life that is willing to be a little bit vulnerable and open to others so that they can be the ones to point out those snares and traps that we've laid for ourselves. So of course, you're not going to catch the trap that you've laid for yourselves. We're too subtle and sneaky. I don't know why I remembered before I came up here, I was remembering, like when I was even in high school, I did this. It's so stupid. But if I had a test the next day, sometimes I would try to sleep at the very edge of my bed so that if I fell out of it, I could somehow use that as an excuse, right, to not go to school, right? Do you know what I'm saying? This is as dumb as sticking the book underneath your pillow and hoping it's going to percolate, the knowledge will percolate up into your brain or something. But no, I literally would do this. And there's a few times where I did this. I would sleep as close to the edge of my bed as possible and just hope that if I fell out of it, I could be like, oh, Mom, Dad, I fell out of the bed. I can't go to school and do this test. It's like, I was trying to set myself up for failure, so to speak, and so that I could have this excuse. I mean, it's foolish and it's silly, but I know Christians who will almost set themselves up for failure, to have an excuse for why they were not loyal. No, I'm gonna pray tomorrow, 5 a.m. Well, if you're not a morning person and you make that kind of a promise and to try and feel better about yourself, you just set yourself up for failure. Maybe in the short term, you're going to feel good about telling people, oh yeah, I'm going to wake up tomorrow to pray early. But if you know full well you're not going to do it, why set yourself up for failure? Just those little kinds of games that we play for ourselves. I guess the reason I bring that up is I wonder if Gideon played, and this is total conjecture, okay? This is just the white space in there, but I just can't help but wonder if Gideon said, well, I got a request for you. What was he thinking? Was it just a little game that he played in his mind to rationalize that he was going to make this ephod? No, this is really for everyone. I'm doing this for everyone. It's not for me. It's for everyone. That's a classic snare that you set up, right? This is really for everyone's benefit. Well, are you getting any benefit? Yeah, but it's going to be so small in comparison to how much it's going to bless everyone else. That's why we need a hot tub at church. This is not for just me, you guys. This is for everybody. I forgot to put it in our special projects, but trust me, the hot tub will be a blessing to everybody because you can all use it. Trust me. I mean, you can run down that kind of attitude. Those little tricks that we get ourselves to gravitate towards to, at the end of the day, just get what we really want. I just wonder, we know how Gideon's life is going to end up, and if that's any indication, if that colors at all what happens here, perhaps we don't have the greatest view and picture of his life. But I appreciate verse 28. And I appreciate verse 35 as well. Because it makes a very honest statement that despite whatever failures and failings Gideon did have, which we can point to clearly, but also that we might suspect he had, here's what could be said. Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more, and the land had rest 40 years in the days of Gideon. There's rest in the days of Gideon. Verse 35, they did not show steadfast love to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in return for all the good that he had done to Israel. See, the Bible still says, the narrator of the text still says that Gideon did do good. Despite all of his failures and flaws, despite even opening the door for us to be suspicious about his motives. We never do that when we read Jesus' life. Did he do that for a good reason or a bad reason? We never question that, but when you read anyone else in the Bible, those questions can come up. For whatever you might think of Gideon, we cannot take away the fact that Gideon, by the grace of God and the power of God, did some good. And after all, is that not ultimately our hope? That God can do genuinely good things through imperfect, flawed, sinful, sometimes very deceptive and self-deceiving people. Yes. That's kind of the basis of our existence, isn't it? That is our hope that God can do that, because if we have to be perfect and holy and acceptable to Him first, then none of us are going to ever get there. But if God's promise is that by the grace shown to us at the cross where our sins can be forgiven, He now empowers us and He can do these good, wonderful works that He's prepared beforehand for us to walk in, then now we have hope. Now I can say, yeah, when I did that thing, it wasn't exactly a pure motive. I mean, there's, I guess a lot of folks flirt to convert. Well, I like that gal. She's not a believer, so I'm going to take the hit and evangelize her and ask her out and bring her to church, every chance I get. It's for her sake, It's so that she'll come to know the Lord. And I'm not getting anything out of this except, she does look nice and smell nice and all those things. But, that is some people's testimony. And it's not a bad thing that someone got saved because they were flirting to convert. The motives, you can question that, and that person may need to repent, but boy, aren't we thankful that God can take us and do something genuinely, legitimately good. That is the gospel. That is our hope, that Jesus is saving us not because we are perfect and deserve it, but even while we are yet sinners. And that he is going to then work all things together for good, for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. So, Gideon. Like him, don't like him, see, the flaws and failures, maybe be suspicious of some of his motives, but what we cannot do is take away from the good that God did in his life. And we would honor Gideon how? The best. By not falling into the same traps and temptations that perhaps he did. That's how we would honor his life and his legacy. And that is actually what the Israelites are accused of not doing. Is exactly that, is to not see the good that God had done through him. And that's going to turn them wayward, and we'll talk about that more next time we are together, and we'll look at a very negative outcome and consequence because of another test, if you want to call it that. But Gideon had many wives, and we're going to see how that all falls out. Now, if you're not a Christian, this evening, you've heard kind of an interesting story of a man that we believe lived almost 3,400 years ago, and yet his condition is much like ours, tempted to fame and glory, and perhaps succeeding in that, and yet being faced with the question of loyalty, and it sounds like failing that one. Well, we are all still there, being tempted by the allures of this life and this world, with the folly and the thought that we can somehow be someone apart from God's work in our life. And unfortunately, we've made it so much more accessible and easy for people to think they can be these big influencers and popular and have all this fame and attention. And yet you also know for every one of those success stories is the story of how this ruined their lives, ruined their relationships, ruined their even view of reality and themselves. It was said that Anthony Bourdain, who had the opportunity to visit so many nations of the world as a journalist and as a world traveler, as someone who shared his experience of globetrotting to adoring fans, loved wherever he went with celebrities and powerful people and the president, and you would think had so much attention and fame and the adoration of everybody. And he said he hated his life. He hated it all. He couldn't stand himself. Of course, unfortunately, he killed himself. That is the test of royalty, the test of loyalty that we all face. If you're not a Christian, God is asking for you to acknowledge him as king. But understand, he's the kind of king that serves you, who gets down on his knees, washes your feet, gets up on a cross, dies for your sins. He's also one who demands our loyalty because he loves us and wants to share everything with us if we would but deny ourselves, deny our own selfish pursuits, and follow him. So if you're not a Christian this evening, I'd love to talk with you. I'd love to share and ask, or send an email, I guess, if you're watching it online. And let's talk about the things that you are pursuing, where you're finding your meaning and purpose. And let us see if we can find what God is calling and asking of you.